Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I'm Jacob Shapiro, the Director of Analysis. Cole, our Managing Editor, is not feeling well today, or he is walking his dogs, or his dogs are walking him. I'm not sure exactly which, but I'm going to be your host today. I am joined, first of all, by Xander Snyder, one of our wonderful analysts. Say hello, Xander.
Hey, Jacob. How's it going?
It is going, which is better than the alternative. Also joined by Philip Orchard, another one of our analysts.
Howdy.
And we're going to talk, it's been a very, very busy week in geopolitics, and we're going to talk about a couple things. Of course, we wanted to talk about Iran and all the things that are happening with U.S. sending an aircraft carrier battle group to the Middle East, ostensibly because Iran is targeting U.S. assets in the region, or at least so Israeli intelligence says. But before we get to Iran and everything going on there, just before we decided to get on this podcast, there was news that the United States had basically taken over a North Korean ship that was being used to smuggle coal into North Korea against UN sanctions. So, Phil, how about you just lead us off by telling us a little bit about what's going on right now with North Korea and the United States in general, and how you think about whether the seizure of this ship is important or not.
I thought you said Cole wasn't feeling well. Now he's being smuggled into North Korea.
Bam.
Yes.
See what I did there?
I did. I don't know, that's called a pun for some of our listeners if you don't know what it is. Probably the first of many on this podcast. I wasn't trying to blow Cole's cover, but that'll be fun for him.
Well, so in the big picture, North Korea and the United States are at an impasse, but one that they can both live with. North Korea has refrained from launching intercontinental ballistic missiles that could potentially hit the U.S. mainland. In the U.S. hasn't given a lot in return, but it's backed off. It's any kind of footing that suggests like it might be prepared to go to war. They're still haven't yet given up the ghost on trying to negotiate full denuclearization. But basically, we've reached this point where as long as North Korea doesn't start testing ICBMs again, as long as the U.S. kind of doesn't, eases off on some of the joint exercises with South Korea and, stops preparations that North Korea sees as basically indistinguishable from an invasion, they can both live with it. But the question now is, like, within that framework, how does North Korea act? We continue to think that it's never, ever, ever, ever going to give up its nuclear weapons. And that gives it some degree of security to act aggressively, to try to improve its position on the region or in the region, especially on the Korean Peninsula. And so what you would see it now doing is kind of probing a little bit with these three test launching these three short range ballistic missiles this week, trying to kind of probe for an opportunity to deepen the growing wedge between the United States and South Korea, the United States potentially in Japan, and so forth. And so this doesn't suggest that the U.S. diplomatic effort has completely failed. The U.S. has succeeded in the big item, which is protecting the U.S. mainland. But there's a lot of questions still to be explored and to ask, and to a lot of room for movement within that framework. So we'll see how it goes from here.
I'm glad you brought up the North Korean short-range missile tests, if that's what they were. I think the South Koreans had some trouble identifying them at first.
It was weird. They were kind of refusing to admit what it was, even though it was kind of clear to everybody based on the open source imagery and different intelligence estimates from around the region. I'm not quite clear why, but they were very reluctant to even admit that it was a short-range missile test. Probably related, at least to some degree, to the political situation at home. President Moon Jae-in has put his neck on the line by reaching out, even more so than the U.S., to buddy up with Kim Jong-un, and he doesn't have a whole lot to show for it yet.
Yeah, and it is particularly interesting timing because if, as you said, it's to try and shake up the deck and try and get the United States back to some kind of negotiating position, it kind of makes sense, although the United States is active in a lot of different places right now, and you would think that the U.S. doesn't want to go with that. But then on the heels of that, you get the United States Justice Department announcing that it has seized this North Korean ship that is used to sell coal to North Korea. And it's not like the ship was seized in some kind of military way or some kind of forceful way, right? The Indonesians have actually had this ship impounded since last year and only just began repatriating the North Korean sailors back to North Korea. But if North Korea was expecting the United States to look at the short-range missile test as sort of a, hey, pay attention to us, we want to get back at the negotiation table, do you think North Korea then looks at the impounding of this ship as sort of a tit-for-tat maneuver? Is it something, a kind of challenge from the United States that North Korea is going to feel like it has to respond to? Or do you think that in North Korea, they'll just be happy that, okay, hey, at least we have the United States' attention. We can work with this. What's the next step now to trying to get them back to the table?
Yeah, I mean, we've been kind of joking internally a little bit that with so much else going on, the U.S. focus on Venezuela and Iran and China and everything else, it's possible that Kim Jong-un is just feeling a little bit lonely and kind of wants to get some attention. But I think this just speaks to the bigger issue of North Korea desperately wants sanctions relief from the U.S. and the fact that they couldn't get very much was a big reason why the last summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un and Hanoi fell apart. Their economy is in bad shape. Their economy is always in bad shape, but it's in particularly bad shape. They're grappling with one of the worst droughts and poorest harvests, in a decade or two. So they're in bad shape. Kim Jong-un he's made this big case that, okay, now that we have nukes, we can pivot to economic development. We can pivot to all this other stuff and start to modernize the nation. It's really hard to do that if the U.S. Is still enforcing, this like global, basically embargo on or still trying to, keep up the pressure from every, corner on there by forcing them to the table through economic, warfare. But for the U.S. perspective, since they're not going to get the nukes, but this is kind of, sanctions are really the only leverage they have left. If they're not willing to go to war, there's not a lot else they can do. And they do have interest in trying to shape North Korea's behaviors as a nuclear power. And that's why they've been very reluctant, not only reluctant to make concessions at the negotiating table on sanctions, but also seeing these kind of moves that they're really worried about the international effort to isolate North Korea falling apart, because the U.S. alone can't do it. They need Chinese cooperation. They need Russian cooperation. They need Southeast Asia on board. It's a little bit why it's interesting that Indonesia's involved. They're still pushing. I don't know how long that can last, because there's a lot of divergent interests, and the U.S. can try to threaten these other countries for not cooperating on sanctions with secondary sanctions and so forth. But we'll see.
Yeah, Phil, I want to throw one more question at you before I bring Xander into a little bit of discussion about North Korea, and that is namely, do you think China has to react at all to the U.S. engaging in this particular way with impounding a ship that is delivering coal to North Korea? Because it always feels like China is simultaneously the most important and yet the least important actor when it comes to all of this. And of course, North Korea is the only country that China has a mutual defense treaty with. So do you think that China at all is going to view this as a U.S. overstep that is going to require any kind of Chinese strongly worded statement or action or anything else?
I'm sure they'll say something about it. But first of all, they have bigger fish to fry with the U.S. And maybe this gives them, some weird way that this gives them leverage with the trade talks. I doubt it. But, if so, then maybe they try to play that advantage. In general, they still are trying to keep up the image that they are cooperating with North Korea, just to avoid making all these other issues more, just to avoid complicating the trade problem with the U.S. and to sort of portray itself internationally as a responsible regional hegemon who is powerful and willing to, contain rogue elements like North Korea. To whatever extent that's actually the case, they haven't come out and just started flagrantly violating the sanctions or announcing that they are not going to comply with them anymore or anything like that. And that, I think that's a little bit telling about what they're actually concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, I only just thought of this, but it is sort of hard to think that it's only coincidence that just as China apparently gets more defiant in negotiations with the United States, that suddenly you have problems again with North Korea. It seems like North Korea is always timed to go off right around the time that China is either doing something or wants something too. But I want to bring Xander in here, and this might be a nice way to segue to Iran in a minute. But before we get there, Xander, I remember it must be a year ago or 2 years ago, you wrote a couple articles for GPF about coal specifically in the context of North Korea. I'm remembering that right. Yeah.
I don't know if I wrote those pieces, but maybe I did. It was like 2 years ago when the first set of negotiations were going on. I mean, I remember the issue. I don't know if I wrote it.
Look, Sander, just claim credit for everything.
Yes, I wrote those pieces.
They were the best pieces. Nobody's ever written better pieces.
Thank you.
But I guess the question that I wanted to circle on is, do you have a sense of how important coal is to the North Korean economy in the first point? And playing off of a little bit of what Philip was saying, I feel like so often the hardest thing about dealing with a country like North Korea or a country like Iran is trying to figure out what the breaking point of the society is when it comes to economic issues or political issues or social issues and things like that. And it always seemed that coal was one of the way that North Korea generated its energy. So it's not like the United States, by impounding the ship that the Indonesians already impounded, is preventing coal from getting to North Korea. And it doesn't look like these sanctions against coal have really done anything meaningful in terms of North Korea's economy. So, I mean, how do you rate what the United States is doing and what the United States can do to put more pressure on North Korea, or if there is even any more pressure to put on North Korea?
Sure. Yeah. I don't recall where North Korea gets the majority of its energy, but I do know as it relates to coal, they derive a fair amount or the majority of their foreign currency from sales of coal. When you have an economy like North Korea's, the currency is to a degree only as valuable as the economy underlying it. So having foreign currency or hard currency like gold is valuable in that sort of economy because it actually retains its value relative to the domestic currency. So for North Korea, one source of a lot of its gold and foreign currency that it can actually use to buy stuff with internationally is coal. So that's one of the big reasons that the U.S. targeted coal, was to try to limit the inflows of foreign currency into North Korea. I don't know what the breaking point is, honestly. It's hard to tell, right? Because people have been saying that whatever the next round of sanctions are going to bring North Korea to its breaking point for the last 20 years, and it just hasn't happened yet. And somehow they keep finding new and creative ways to get around it. And now with the advent of different types of cryptocurrency, I think it was maybe a year ago, there's a story about North Korean hackers somehow stealing tens of millions of dollars from a cryptocurrency exchange. And, maybe that supplements some of their lack of hard currency or foreign currency as we go forward. It's hard to tell, but I do remember the number from coal exports being like in the billions. A lot of it goes to China, I believe.
A lot of it goes to Russia as well.
Does it go to both? Okay. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. It's right there, right?
But if I could just jump in here, I mean, the reason why coal was, I think you described it right, is that it's a source of currency for them. That's the main thing. The reason why it was even allowed to be in the sanctions, why Russia and China in particular allowed the UN sanctions to cover coal, is because they apparently concluded that depriving North Korea of that currency, of those, export revenue, would not would not lead to a collapse of the regime. Unlike, say, oil imports, where China and Russia were very careful to, refuse to support a blanket ban on oil exports to North Korea, basically stopping sanctions at the level where they thought that Pyongyang could get enough to survive, but still be hurt by them. And so, I mean, neither Beijing nor Moscow would allow international sanctions to be at the point where to extend to the point where it could actually cripple the regime. And the fact that coal wasn't even involved highlights that.
I mean, that plus the coal sanctions went into effect, and then North Korea kept exporting coal. They just had to hide it a little bit, right? They would do a lot of these ship-to-ship transfers where one North Korean ship would leave and then they transfer all the coal to like a Russian ship or something like that. And they do it with transponders turned off, so it was really hard to track. So it could have been that either Russia and China thought that it was not critical in the sense that coal sanctions were going to push North Korea to its limits, or they knew that there was an easy workaround that maybe wasn't available for oil imports?
Yeah, that's a good point. Although I think both countries knew that there was a risk of getting, given the U.S. surveillance powers and ability to monitor these things these days, that put them at risk of getting slapped with secondary sanctions and stuff. Even they're doing ship-to-ship transfers with oil as well, and those were carefully calibrated not to spike the regime.
All right. Well, I know that we could talk about North Korea all day if we let ourselves, but I do want to also hit on Iran a little bit for listeners and for readers out there. Xander, I wonder if you could, there's a lot of different things to break apart here. And I think the two that I want to talk about before we get out of here is, number one, what's going on in terms of the threat that the United States is perceiving from Iran in the region, the U.S. military deployments, the rationale behind that, and then also the news that Iran has threatened to basically stop following stipulations in the JCPOA, which is the acronym for the Iran nuclear deal, about uranium enrichment and things that it's doing at its heavy water reactor in Iraq. So, Xander, maybe just start us off by summarizing what happened at the beginning of the week. What was the United States seeing? What do we know about what the United States saw? And what has the United States actually done in response to that in terms of Iran?
Basically, we don't know exactly what the threat is for sure, but we can kind of read the tea leaves of the statements a little bit, plus the context and what we know about Iran's involvement in Iraq and the different ways that it could potentially threaten U.S. interests there, and kind of at least get a sense of what the threats could have been and sort of why the U.S. has responded the way it has. So for starters, a big brouhaha was made over the weekend when announcement of this deployer of the carrier strike group, the USS Abraham Lincoln, I think it went with a couple of destroyers and a few other ships, was deployed to the Middle East, plus a small squadron of heavy bombers were deployed to the Al Udeid Air Base in Doha, Qatar. Now, the carrier strike group, that deployment was basically already scheduled, and we keep carrier strike groups in and around sort of the Eastern Med fairly regularly anyways. So it might have been that the administration or people within the administration wanted to make a bigger deal out of a deployment that was already going to happen for political purposes. So it's worth keeping that in mind. The bomber deployment does seem incremental, additional to what was initially planned. And what we know about that is there are two B-52 bombers that were flown to Al Udeid, and I think two more that have either already left Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, or they're going to soon. So 4 bombers and a carrier strike group that was probably already going to be nearby anyways. So then the question is, what is the threat? Well, Mike Pompeo canceled a meeting to Berlin at the last minute to fly to Iraq, and we didn't know where he was going at first. And news kind of leaked afterwards, after he basically, there were some rumors before he went, but then after he left, there's a little bit more detail because it was kept under wraps. And we know that he flew into Baghdad and was there for about 4 hours and had a couple of quick meetings, made some statements to the effect of supporting our partners in Iraq, et cetera, and then bounced. So there's probably something going on in Iraq for Pompeo to fly there at the last minute after the deployment of these forces and make a statement like that. So what do we know about Iran's presence in Iraq? Well, one, they have a lot of militias that they fund. That whole thing really got going when Iraq was fighting ISIS, in 2014, 2015, when ISIS still has strong foothold in Syria and Iraq. Iran funded a lot of these militia groups called Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF groups. And it's really important to know, as these PMF groups come more into the focus of sort of mainstream media and people start talking about them, that they are not homogeneous. There are many, many, many PMF groups. I think last time I did a detailed look and we have a deep dive on the subject, there were something like 65 or 67 PMF groups. They are not all loyal to Iran. And in fact, one of the big power struggles going on in Iraq, it has to do with the chain of command of these PMF militias, whether they report directly to the Iraqi central government in Baghdad or whether they report to Iran. So there are pro-Iran groups, there are pro-Iraqi government groups, and then there are pro-al-Sistani groups, who's another Shia cleric in Iraq, and they tend to be the pro-Sistani groups tend to also kind of be pro-Iraq. They have more of a nationalist flavor than a pro-Iran flavor, if you want to call it that. So there are, though, a lot of PMF groups that are basically either directly funded by Iran or armed by Iran and are loyal to Iran, and many of whose leaders now have important positions in the government. And that's sort of the second piece here in terms of the U.S.-Iran power struggle going on in Iraq. Because Iran has so much power in terms of actual guns on the ground, after ISIS was defeated, a lot of these now former PMF militia leaders ran for office within Iraq and won. And now some of them control the purse strings and are responsible for deciding which PMF groups get Iraqi government funding. And I think there's something like $1 billion every year that's allocated to PMF funding. So this is clearly one of the potential threats, that Iran had gone and told some of its militia groups in Iraq to attack some sort of U.S. Base or force or something, right? And so then the next question is, well, what are the targets in Iraq? And there's kind of a couple of broad categories, one of which is just major U.S. military bases that are still in Iraq. And, you know, the U.S. presence in Iraq is not what it used to be. I think there's 5,500 U.S. troops still stationed in Iraq. They still have several military bases there, but not, you know, on the scale of 2007, clearly. So one might just be attacking one of these bases, like Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq. Another could be attacking one of the smaller bases that the U.S. seemed to set up in December 2018 after it announced its short withdrawal timeline from Syria. It said, peace, we're leaving Syria. And then very quickly after that said, but, you know, we're actually going to set up these two military bases in Iraq right on the border of Syria. So it's kind of like, okay, how much of a withdrawal is it really? That's another potential target. And then we've done a fair amount of work on U.S. collaboration and cooperation with Kurdish forces in Iraq, because there's actually a lot of, and this gets very confusing, there's a lot of Iranian Kurdish forces based in Iraq. And that's because Iranian Kurdish parties are illegal in Iran. So they have fled and are basically stationed in Iraqi Kurdistan, even though they are anti-Iranian government and not really, their political purpose has nothing to do with the Iraqi government. There were a lot of seemingly disconnected events that actually seem to hint that the U.S. is providing more direct support to anti-Iranian Iranian Kurdish groups, so Kurdish groups that are against the Iranian government. So it might be that could be another target that the pro-Iran PMF groups could potentially target without escalating the situation to such a degree that would result from hitting U.S. forces directly. It could be hitting these U.S. allied forces, or, I mean, they're not explicitly publicly allied, but there's a fair amount of evidence that the U.S. is supporting them. So those are sort of some of the on-the-ground potential targets in Iraq. We've also seen stories that have been released about Iran transferring missiles on boats, and that may be being related to this general threat that the U.S. has talked about. We don't really know much about that. We don't know if the missiles on boats have to do with missiles that can be fired from boats, or if they're just being transferred somewhere, and we don't really know where they're being transferred. But it seems like the threat that the U.S. is talking about has to do, at least partially, with Iraq.
All right. Well, I know that my head is spinning a little bit from all that, so I'm sure listeners' heads are spinning a little bit too. But I wanted to emphasize one thing that you just said, and then sort of zoom out a little bit to what's going on now with the Iran nuclear deal. And that is, why are there Iranian-backed Shiite militias in Iraq? The reason for that is because one thing, and there are not many things you can say this right now for, but one thing the United States and Iran have in common is they both don't like the Islamic State. Iran viewed the Islamic State as an existential threat. The United States viewed the Islamic State not necessarily as an existential threat, but certainly as a serious threat to U.S. interests in the Middle East. Because if you can get all the Sunni Arab disaffected Muslims, rallying around this ISIS flag, which is basically this weird form of religious totalitarianism, that could be really bad. This wasn't part of the Iranian nuclear deal, but one of the things happened after the Iranian nuclear deal was that the U.S. used air power to help defeat ISIS, and Iran threw money and fighters in order to defeat ISIS on the ground in Iraq. And that was sort of a deal with the devil that both sides made. And now that ISIS has been defeated, you're getting all these things where people are having to unravel these strange bedfellows that they had before. I think that's something that people tend to overlook, because there definitely is a conflict between the United States and Iran over who is going to have influence in Iraq. But part of the reason that conflict is there is because that both the United States and Iran had to work together in this weird way in order to defeat ISIS. They sort of had to take it one problem at a time. But I want to zoom out a little bit here, and this gets back to our question about North Korea, and pose this to both of you, which is that the Iran nuclear deal has been defunct, I guess, almost for a year now. That's when the United States pulled out. But Iran was basically staying compliant with the deal because it was hoping that everybody else who had been a party to the Iran nuclear deal, which is namely the United Kingdom, Germany, France, even China and Russia, that they would keep to the terms of the deal, and that Iran could sell its oil and get banking considerations and all these things, and that if the United States wasn't going to go along, fine, but that the Iranian economy would be able to expect those things from those countries. I think one of the things that has happened, and for me this might be a more serious threat than the carrier battle group, is that the United States said last week that there's going to be no more sanctions waivers for countries that are importing Iranian oil. And for a country, and Xander, you've written a lot about this, I've written about this a little bit. Iran is a country where the economy is really under a lot of stress. You've got drought in certain places, you've got high inflation, you've got people in the streets angry about Iran spending money in Syria when people are starving at home, and the price of eggs and other staples is increasing, all these other things. Now you have the United States saying, okay, part of our maximum pressure campaign is that you're not going to be able to export anywhere. And I think at that point, the current Iranian government, which is more of a pragmatic flavor, said, well, look, we can't keep waiting for Germany and France and China and Russia to do the things that they were supposed to do with the Iran nuclear deal. We need to shake up the deck ourselves. And the only thing that we have to do that is really our nuclear weapons program. Because if Iran was to meaningfully attack a U.S. target, I personally think the United States would probably use that as a justification for even more military activity that Iran doesn't really want. So I say all that to say that, now that we have the Iran nuclear deal falling apart, and Philip, you and I on previous podcasts have talked about the utility or lack thereof of the Iran nuclear deal, to the question I want to pose to both of you before we get out of here is, where do you think this goes from here? We've got the United States, with military assets in the region now. We've got the United States threatening to cut off Iran from its last remaining serious economic lifelines to the world. You've got Iran once again threatening nuclear weapons programs and threatening to abrogate the Iran nuclear deal. So let's start with Xander and then Philip. Just give me 2 minutes each about what you think are the next steps for Iran here.
The next steps for Iran. That's a good question. It's really, it's like you said, they're under a lot of pressure, and that pressure, both internal, external, is one of the reasons that our forecast for this year was Iran beginning to withdraw some of its forces from the Middle East. And we've already seen signs that Iran is struggling to fund Hezbollah. Yemen is a little less clear. The Houthis are clearly still fighting. And I think that might be in part because it just doesn't seem like Iran spends as much in Yemen as it does in Syria and Lebanon. In terms of next steps for Iran, I mean, I basically think that if they don't have any flexibility and the JCPOA isn't working for them, they do probably restart enrichment. And both uranium, which was one of the restrictions, and activities at the Arak heavy water facility, which is where they, I believe, can produce plutonium as well. So they have both options, because that is how they're going to generate any sort of leverage with the U.S. It's hard to tell, again, what the threshold is for like regime collapse or something, and regime changes, something that's beginning to be mentioned more and more in the news again, just because Iran has been under really stringent sanctions before, and the regime has found a way to stick around. Now, the U.S. is going after more than just oil now. New sanctions just announced this week are on Iranian metal exports such as copper and steel and iron, which are, I think, iron and aluminum are like its fourth biggest export, and copper is its 10th, something like that. So meaningful amounts of dollars. And if Iran can't get any of the benefits from the JCPOA, can't get access to the capital that it was hoping to use to reinvest into its own economy, and it just doesn't have a lot of money to spend, then you probably will start seeing somewhat decreased involvement in different areas of the Middle East and probably a resumption of enrichment activities.
I mean, I think it comes down to really the simple question of, does Iran think the U.S. is willing to go to war to stop its nuclear program? If not, then I think we start seeing it go down this road again to if nothing else, to revive leverage and try to pull people back to the table and carve out some waivers, some exceptions, and maybe lay the groundwork for a JCPOA 0.2 or 2.0 or whatever. If they do think the U.S. is is willing to go to war, then the lesson for so many of these countries, from Libya, from North Korea now, is that if you get the bomb, you're good. Like then everyone will talk. Everyone will you'll still have enemies, you'll still have problems, but but no one's going to come in and try to take you out. The problem for Iran though is that it's not North Korea, but in 2017, when the Trump administration was pounding his fist on the table and threatening to go to war, North Korea had nukes. Full stop. They had ways to deliver them. They had ways to strike U.S. troops. They had ways to deter invasions and so forth. The U.S. could have attacked, and maybe someday it still will. It could, if it decided it was important enough to bear that cost, it could have done it. But there's a non-negligible risk that it ends in nuclear war. And at minimum, North Korea's conventional capabilities would mean massive losses of U.S. troops and the troops of U.S. allies in the region. Iran's just not at that point. So they're in the George always says the most dangerous window in a nuclear program is when you're close to getting it, but you don't quite have it yet, because that's when you're you can't deter things, and other your adversaries have the most reason to try to put an end to it. Not only that, basically comparing to North Korea, no one else in the region was willing to support a war, except maybe Japan. Japan's kind of always hoped that the U.S. would find a way to deal with North Korea, but was really vulnerable to massive losses if the war actually broke out. Iran's situation, it's looking around at it in a lot of Gulf regimes that would love and kind of urging the U.S. to maybe do something about it. Plus Israel. So it comes down to that question. I suspect for now that they are trying to show that they're serious about willing to go down that road to see what it gets, to see if maybe it prods Europe into action. Maybe if they, maybe they can call the U.S.'s bluff, by doing that. But if the threat is real, if the threat of U.S. action is real, then it's hard to say, but it seems unlikely that they'll be willing to push too far. On the other hand, if they think the U.S. is gunning for any kind of excuse to come in and settle the issue once and for all, then maybe if nuclear weapons is really the only way to stop that, then they go after it hard. What do you think, Jacob?
I think. Well, I was going to say on that uplifting note, we should end it, but no, I think that Iran. I think this is as much about the internal dynamic of Iran as it is about the external dynamic, and I think this is true in the United States too. I think there's disagreement inside the United States about what the right way is to deal with Iran. I think that when you look at the hawks in the Trump administration, you've got people like Bolton and Pompeo, and they want to take it to Iran. They want to put as much pressure on Iran as possible. You've got others in the United States who don't think that's the right way to put pressure on Iran, but also still fundamentally want regime change. And a lot of the policy, I think, that you're seeing out of the United States is between the differences between those two factions. Inside of Iran itself, you also have multiple factions. So I think the Rouhani government basically was betting on the Iran nuclear deal to not only make the Iranian economy a lot better, but if it could make the Iranian economy a lot better, that would make the civilian government in Iran a lot stronger. Because it hasn't, the civilian government in Iran is a lot weaker. And that means the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which the United States just named a terrorist organization, that means that they're going to be calling more of the shots inside of Iran. The IRGC, as they're known, they are much more aggressive. They are much more defiant. They are much more interested in proving just how tough Iran is and how resilient the revolution is. They're literally charged with protecting the revolution. And the worst case scenario is if you get the hawks in the United States putting maximum pressure on Iran, which undercuts the pragmatists or the people that you might be able to deal with on a more pragmatic basis, and in so doing empower the exact people who will respond to that kind of pressure with wanting to use force in and of itself. If you go back to what Xander was talking about in terms of what exactly was the threat that the United States picked up, my guess is that you had the IRGC trying to say, we have to be tough, we have to do something, we have to show the world and the Americans that we can't be pushed around. And the Iranian government, the civilian government, still had enough power and still had the support of the supreme leader to say, no, that's not what's going to happen right now. We're going to put that IRGC plan away. I think the United States reacted the way that it did, but that's probably my guess. As things get worse in Iran, this isn't 79. The IRGC is very, very powerful. It controls large swaths of the economy. And if you get into this situation where you've got the IRGC staring at a very hawkish U.S. government, yeah, then maybe you do. I don't know exactly what that looks like. I mean, Iran can't afford any kind of conventional battle with the United States, but then you start talking about what does a proxy conflict look like? What are the areas that Iran can put pressure on the United States? What countries can Iran reach out to try and put pressure on the United States? Thus far, Iran has not been able to get much of anything out of Russia and China, but maybe it would be willing to give some things to Russia and China it hasn't been willing to give yet in order to get some kind of reprieve. So that's where I get worried. I get worried when you get in any situation where you get into a situation where the actors feel like they don't have choices. And I don't feel like we're quite there yet with Iran, but, just the story of this entire year has been the space on both sides is just narrowing and narrowing and narrowing to the point where when I look at Iran right now, it's got no choice but to try and raise the nuclear weapons program and see if it can get the United States back to the table. Just like the United States, it has talked and done all this, and it has no choice but to look tough and to make sure that it has enough military assets deployed so that it can match at least some of its bark with some bite. So that's where I'm at with that.
I think those are really good points. I mean, one other thing to keep in mind is that we're, I don't know, 18 months away from possibly having a new administration in the White House. And, to what extent that actually matters, countries, we always say that specific presidents don't fundamentally reorient a country's foreign posture. But on, these kind of narrow decisions, other countries certainly think they might, and so I think right now we see North Korea trying to run out the clock a little bit on the Trump administration, China trying to drag things out into an election year where, Trump's not going to want to be screwing with the economy too much. And I think Iran had been hoping to do that. And there's still some kind of window, to maybe back off a little bit to string this along. And maybe you get another administration that's a little bit more, dovish or a little bit more willing to reinstate the JCPOA.
Yeah.
But man, that's a long window. That's a long window, and they can't be feeling too good.
No, they can. And I think it's a good point also because I would just emphasize that I think a lot of the problems here were that both of the governments that agreed to the JCPOA or to the Iran nuclear deal were very weak. The Obama government was very weak going into that deal. It did not have a lot of domestic support. The Rouhani government, which I think Americans don't quite realize, was also very weak. That required a tremendous amount of political capital from Iran to reach that deal. And the terms of the Iran nuclear deal were very, very limited. It was a very, very narrow agreement. And you might have been able to see a world in which that was the first step in a larger trust-building measure between the United States and Iran, but that's just not how it worked. They signed the agreement, and Iran went to doing ballistic missile testing, went to using its militias to try and strengthen its position in the Middle East, and the U.S. Elected Trump and went back to thundering away against Iran, and sort of almost immediately all the trust was undermined. And I think that's in part because the governments that went into it were so weak, and it was such a weak and narrow agreement. I bring that up because for any future administration, whether it's an American one or an Iranian one or both of them, what you have here, though, is that you had two sides make a deal and the deal unraveled. And I think the United States was in a difficult position because if it stayed in the deal, a lot of its interests in the region were not going to be kept up. On the other hand, by withdrawing from the deal, both in terms of how Iran views the United States and in terms of the broader international community, it looks like the U.S. reneged on some commitments. I understand why the U.S. did it, and there's an argument to be made that it was the right decision. and that a lot of the problems come with the deal itself in its original form, that it just wasn't structured very well. But that means that if you do eventually get to administrations that want to talk to each other again or want to make some kind of common cause, it's going to be even harder to build up that kind of trust, because Iran's going to look at the United States and say, why do we have any reason to trust you? Because you reneged on the nuclear deal. And the United States can look at Iran and say, why should we trust you? You signed a deal with us, and then you turned around and started testing ballistic missiles and started funding Hezbollah and Hamas, and you had your Shiite militias trying to take over Iraq. So, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of hurdles. And like you said, the 18 months is a long window, but also just the fact that the United States and Iran have so little reason to trust each other in the first place. And the JCPOA, which could have been, if it had been, I don't know, better structured, or if it had been more comprehensive, or if the governments involved had more support, maybe it could have been a trust building maneuver. I think in the end, it actually probably undermined the very thing that it was trying to do. And that's one of the reasons we're in the position that we're in now.
Yeah, good points.
All right. I think we'll get out of here on this. I want to encourage listeners. Geopolitical Futures just did a website redesign. It looks very sexy. It looks very nice. There's a lot of great content up on the website right now. If you want to read some of Xander's thoughts, especially on what's going on in Turkey, what's going on with the Istanbul mayoral elections, why is the Turkish lira so weak, he's got a great piece up this week. Philip, I believe you have a piece coming out very soon about Hong Kong and the protests that have been going on there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, we've got some other things here about China and African swine fever and about Venezuela, all the coverage on Iran that you could possibly want. Canadian readers might be interested to know that there's even some geopolitical Canadian thoughts on the homepage as well. So if you're Canadian, check us out, consider a subscription. Otherwise, I'm Jacob. This was Xander and Philip. We'll see you next time.